I'm really excited because today is the day I make my very first quilt. And whether this is your first quilt or your 101st quilt, I would love it if you would sew along with me. Since this is my very first quilt, I have created a simple log cabin pattern with all squares and rectangles so that I don't have to sew any curves or complicated seams. A standard log cabin quilt uses light and dark values, so today I have 4 dark value fat quarters and 4 light value fat quarters for my log pieces. I have a yard of dark fabric for a border, and I have 2 yards of a light fabric for the back. I also plan to make half of the chimneys out of my light fabric and half the chimneys out of my dark fabric. But if you prefer to use one fabric for both the border and the chimneys, that's the centerpiece of the log cabin, then a medium tone fabric will work well. In place of batting, I'm going to use this fleece blanket. You may also need some different tools depending on how you plan to cut out your quilt and sew it together. I will be using polyester thread. I know most people prefer cotton in quilts, but since I ordered this fabric online and it came in as a polyester instead of a cotton, then the polyester thread will work just fine. You will also need something to cut your fabric with. A lot of quilters use rotary cutters and mats, but I just have some good old scissors, so I'm going to be using scissors for mine. You will also need some sort of washable marker or pencil to mark on your fabric with, as well as some sort of ruler. All of these log pieces are 2.5 inches wide. I have 3 12.5 inch logs, 6 10.5, 6 8.5, 6 6.5, and 3 4.5 inch logs. For the chimney, I have 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares. This template includes a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So my final logs will be 2 inches wide. My final chimneys will be 4 inches by 4 inches, and the completed blocks will be 12 inches square. You will split your template up into 2 sides. You will have 3 6.5, 3 8.5, and 3 10.5 inch pieces on both sides. On one side you will have 2 4.5 with 1 12.5 inch, and the other side will have 1 4.5 with 2 12.5 inch pieces. I also have 6 4.5 inch squares for the chimneys. If you want to make all your chimneys one color, you're welcome to use 1 block or 12. And the most efficient layout is to set the 8.5 and the 6.5 logs next to each other, as well as the 10.5 and the 4.5. This will be your layout for the template with 1 12.5 inch log and 2 4.5 inch logs. Use this template for 2 12.5 inch logs and 1 4.5 inch log. Use one set of logs for 2 of your light valued fabrics and the other set of logs for your other 2 light valued fabrics. You will then repeat with your dark valued fabrics. It is recommended to square your fabric up before you cut so that all your logs are going to be cut on the proper grain of the fabric. That was an absolute nightmare. I will never be cutting a quilt out with a pair of scissors again. Next time I make a quilt, I'm going to be using a rotary cutter like I should have with this one. Now that you've cut out all your fabric, you should have 6 4.5 inch wide logs, 12 6.5, 12 8.5, 12 10.5, and 6 12.5 inch wide logs in your dark fabric and also in your light fabric. You should have 12 4.5 by 4.5 inch chimneys all together. If you're using half light and half dark values, you should have 6 of each. Don't worry about cutting out the border just yet because we'll do that when we're done making the top. You will construct your log cabin by taking one light or dark chimney and take the opposite value 4.5 inch log and place it on the first side. You will then take each a light and a dark 6.5 inch piece and set them on the top and bottom. Next, you will take a light and dark 8.5 inch piece and set that on the sides. And then you'll take a light and dark 10.5 inch piece, and your final log will be a 12.5 inch dark valued piece. And this will also look best if you make sure that you use one pattern from each fat quarter on each block. If you want to, you're welcome to lay all your blocks out before you sew them, or you can sew them all individually. And now that we have the hard part out of the way, we can get to sewing. I have my whole station set up to sew. Log cabin quilts take a lot of pressing, so I actually have a towel laid over my table so that I can iron on my table next to my sewing machine. You will want to press your seams with your iron. You do not want to use steam because that can shrink your fabric. I do always recommend a pre-wash fabric no matter what you are sewing, no matter how much you think it's going to shrink afterwards. I always recommend to pre-shrink your fabric, and that's what I did with mine. So hopefully we won't have any shrinkage from this fabric while we're pressing or after I wash it when it's completed. Traditionally, when you construct a log cabin quilt, you'll press your seams open and outwards towards the edges of the blocks, but you're welcome to press your seams open if you're hand quilting. This will reduce the bulk and make it easier for you to put a needle through when you're hand quilting it. I have my iron set to a nice cool setting because the bulk of my fabric is polyester. I laid out all my logs and chimneys in advance so it will be easier for me to sew each log cabin block. I set up my machine with my yellow thread already, and I also ran a test strip, and I realized it was pulling on the fabric a little bit, so I switched my needle out for a finer tipped needle, and I noticed I had better results that way. We are using a very scant 1/4 inch seam allowance for this project. If you follow the directions correctly, you'll have your first log cabin quilt block. 1 down, 11 to go. It's best to lay your quilt blocks down flat when you're done sewing them so that they don't wrinkle or crease. Alright guys, we made it! We have 12 log cabin quilt blocks, 6 with the dark center and 6 with the light center. Now we're gonna lay our log cabin blocks out in a 3x4 grid to make our quilt tops. You can use whatever layout you want for this project. You can even make something fun and asymmetrical like this. I'm going with a nice diagonal line motif to minimize the number of logs that are adjacent to other logs with the same pattern on them. I've also alternated my light and dark chimneys throughout the quilt top. Hi, bye. You wanna say hi to my YouTube? Oh, is that so? I think he's claimed it as his own. When you sew your quilt top together, you either want to sew 3 rows of 4 or 4 rows of 3 blocks together. I think it'll be easier to sew 3 rows of 4. So I'm going to sew these blocks together first, and these blocks together second, and these last 4 blocks together last. Now that you have 4 blocks sewn into 3 rows, we're going to sew those 3 rows together. And again, make sure you press your seams nice and flat. Now that I have my quilt top put together, I want to add a border. And I'm going to use this dark fabric that I used for the chimneys as a border. To keep in line with the thickness of my logs, I'm going to use my 2.5 inch wide templates for the border. I can also tell that my quilt has stretched and shrunk a little bit due to the polyester fabric being more difficult to work with. That's evident in seeing all these puckers in the fabric. Even though I pressed it down, it's still not laying completely flat. In order to make this quilt square, I'm going to take measurements from the center of my quilt where it's shorter and make sure that my border is that long. I measured my quilt width to be 35.5 inches, so I cut out 2 strips of fabric that were 35.5 inches wide. So the next step is to fold the quilt in half. You want the fold line to sit as center on the quilt as possible. My edge is not even. I'm just going to try to line up the edge as best as I possibly can and go from there. Fold the top layer back enough so you can put your border pieces down. Take half of your length of the quilt top and measure from the fold line to the edge. Mine's 47.5 inches wide, so I'm going to take 23 3/4 from the fold line to the edge. You want to take your 2 border pieces wrong sides together and lay them down along the top of your quilt. Pin down the border. You should double check it in the middle and on both sides. Fold that top flap over the border and pin the other side of the border to the top flap. If you need to flip your quilt over and start from there, you can do that as well, but you should be able to pin it this way. Open your quilt up and measure from one edge of the border to the other to make sure that they're the same length you originally measured them. I'm going for 47.5 inches. And I have 47.5 inches on this side, but I want to check the middle and the other end as well. And if your quilt top is not perfectly square like mine is, follow your seam along the edge of the border, not along the edge of the quilt top, because we want it to be perfectly square along that border. Your last border will be the length of your quilt plus 4.5 inches for the edges of the border as well. So I cut my final borders to 52 inches. Now if I measured correctly, I should be able to lay up my final border between the two edges just like this and pin them down. You can always fold your quilt lengthwise and use the same method we used on the first border for the second one as well. And mine lines up well. I can pin this down and sew the last two borders on. After you have your border sewn onto your quilt, it's time to make the quilt sandwich. Now a quilt sandwich can be any two fabrics, your quilt topper and your quilt backing, with some sort of batting in between. Now most people buy batting rolls from the fabric store, but those come in a lot of different types and sizes, so you want to do your research before you pick one. Some types of batting will be easier to hand quilt, some types will be easier to machine quilt, and some are going to be thicker and some are going to be thinner. If you have a much softer, less stiff batting, you're going to need to quilt it a lot closer together. But if you're using something like a blanket, like I am, you don't have to make your quilt lines all that close together. You could even tie your quilt and it would still stay together well because the batting layer is not going to pull apart inside the quilt due to normal use and washing. So I have both my quilt top rolled up and my batting layer rolled up. First, I'm going to lay out my batting roll. Start by laying your backing fabric upside down and flat. Then put your batting on top of your backing fabric. You want to overlap the edges a few inches so that your batting has room to shrink when you quilt it. Now I'm not expecting this fleece blanket to shrink a lot since it is so very thin, but I'm still going to leave a few extra inches in case it does. Then roll your batting out across the backing of your fabric, making sure it's even all the way around and nice and flat. Once that's flat, we're ready for the quilt top. Leave a few inches of backing fabric overlapping your quilt top so that you have room to bind it, because we're going to finish this with a self-binding. Then unroll it across. If your quilt is completely flat and you sewed all your seams perfectly, this will be really easy. But if your fabric warped a bit or you're not very good at your seam allowances, you might have a few lumps like I do on my quilt. Just try the best to flatten the blocks out the best you can. You want to set it up so that it'll be easier to quilt and will look nice when you're done quilting. Next, we'll baste it down with some quilting pins. These are very similar to safety pins, but you'll see they have a little curve in them. That will help keep your quilt from warping when you pin them. Starting from the center, we're going to put a pin in the middle of each block. After you pin the blocks, you can put a pin in each edge and on the corners. After basting your quilt sandwich together, you are ready to mark your quilting design on it. You can use a pen or a pencil that is safe for fabrics. I tested this pen out on all my fabric scraps to make sure that it will dissolve. You can always use masking tape if you want to mark the lines on your quilt with that. Just make sure that your glue comes off the fabric when you're done with it. I'm going to doodle some sunflowers on each block freehand because this quilt's not perfect already. I don't need to use a perfect quilting pattern for it either. Also keep in mind that this pen may be more visible on light fabrics than dark fabrics, and I also found a use for this polyester because this fabric pen comes out of the polyester a lot easier than the cotton. Once your pen sits on there a few seconds, it'll start to darken, so you don't have to press very hard or make a lot of lines, just get a very simple outline of it. And now you're ready to quilt. You can use either a machine or you can hand quilt. If you use a machine, make sure you use a walking foot and adjust all your tension before you start quilting with a test quilt sandwich. And if you're quilting by hand, use the smallest, sharpest needle you can find. You can also use hoops to outline each block. Either way, just go at it. Let's get this quilt quilted. Today I started hand quilting my quilt. I am not using an embroidery hoop for this, but you are welcome to use one if you prefer it. I'm using about an arm's length of polyester thread. I know a lot of quilters are really particular about using cotton thread and using the different weights of thread, so it's a good idea to look that up if it's something you're interested in using. But since my quilt is mainly polyester, I'm going to use some polyester thread for it, and I'm using the same yellow that I used for the piecing because I think it's fun and I like the yellow. When you quilt, there is a method called knotting in where you take the knot and you knot it into the quilt sandwich itself so that there's no visible knot showing on your final product. The way to do that is to take your knot into your fabric, separate the layers just a little bit and tug until your knot feeds through the fabric. I like to knot in from the bottom because it's easier for me to pinch the fabric from the bottom than the top of the quilt. If you knot incorrectly, you will not see the knot from either side of your fabric. Also, it's best to quilt from the center of your quilt towards the edges. I'm quilting the center of the flowers first and then the petals. I have found that it is easier to work mostly from the top side of the quilt because there's a lot of fabric here. It's easy to get your needle lost on the bottom side of your quilt. So I am stitching into the quilt from the top side, grabbing it underneath, lining up the next stitch, and then pulling the whole thing through the top side. I know some quilters use a method of rocking the needle back and forth through the quilt. You use really short needles called betweens or quilting needles for this technique. And I feel like it's one that takes a lot of work to get up to being able to do well and with a consistent stitch. So for now, I'm just going to take it slowly. I'm using a very simple running stitch for this. It's probably the most common stitch to use in quilting, but there are some fun stitches you can use if you want to get more creative with it. This is probably going to take a long time to finish. It took me about a week to sew the top of the quilt, and I used a sewing machine for that. I fully expect it to take about another week to hand quilt this whole thing, so I will see you probably in about a week. So hand quilting this took about a week, a little bit longer, and I spent several days quilting from dawn until dusk. So if you're gonna hand quilt your quilt, make sure you leave a little bit of time for yourself, but it is definitely worth it because this turned out beautifully. I've removed all the pins from my quilt, and it is now time to remove all these marks. You want to use a wet cloth that is very soft, so like this is a t-shirt, so it's nice and soft. It's not going to cause too many abrasions on the quilt. And you want to make sure you use cold water because hot water will set the marks in. You want to make sure you use cold water for this. And you're just going to rub gently. You don't have to be too aggressive. You're just gonna wipe the marks off. If you want to make it easier on yourself, bring yourself a little bowl of cold water to the table so you can dip your rag in it. Once you have all your marks wiped off, you're ready for the final stage of quilting, which is the binding. We're going to use a self-binding on this quilt. So we want to cut the edge of the binding to about 2 inches, 1.5 inches. You just want to have enough binding so that you can fold it over and stitch it down to the front of the quilt top. Start by trimming your batting to about 1/2 inch over the edge of your quilt. Cut your backing about 1 inch to 2 inches wide all the way around the edges of your quilt. You can use pins or clips to hold your binding in place. You generally want your binding to be about 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick. You can simply fold your edges over each other and finish your corner with an overlap. I found the easiest way to make a metered corner is to fold the corner in first and then roll your edges towards the inside. If your fabric's not perfectly square, you might have a more exaggerated point on the end, but I think that looks pretty good, so I'm gonna go with it. When you have all your edges pinned down, you're ready to bind your quilt on the sewing machine. You're welcome to hand sew this if you want, but it will be a lot quicker on the sewing machine. Make sure you use a walking or even feed foot when you are sewing your binding on, so your binding doesn't slip and wrinkle. Also, make sure that you lubricate your walking foot. If you don't, it might sound really rickety and it might produce metal shavings that then fall onto your quilt or your machine. You may also want to use a wide stitch length for this and test it out on a piece of scrap fabric with your batting in the middle before you start sewing. Also, make sure you take it nice and slowly with your walking foot. You don't want to go too fast or it could break. They are known for breaking. You will need to pivot around the corners as well. It's done! No, I finished my first quilt.
Good job.
No.
What?
Bobbin ran out. When I had like 6 inches left. If you did not pre-wash your quilt, make sure you throw a color catcher in the first time you wash it. You want to take great care when you are washing your quilt in a washing machine. If you have an agitator in your washing machine, you want to wrap it around the agitator with the backing of the quilt on the inside so the agitator doesn't pull apart the quilt top. It can cause distress, and if your seams were not perfect or they weren't wide enough, they can fall apart in the washing machine. So wash it on a delicate setting with cold water. And if you have a really colorful quilt like mine, it is best to use a laundry detergent for colored fabrics. It might also be good to run your quilt through 2 cycles of the wash the first time you wash it, just to make sure you get out all of the markings that were on the front. And make sure before you dry it the first time that all your markings are washed off, that way you don't set them in. It is always best to hang dry or lay your quilt flat to dry, but it's not always easiest. When you dry your quilt in a dryer, you want to use a low heat setting. It can cause some of the fabrics to shrink more than others, and it can also damage the batting on the inside of your quilt. That didn't work. Seriously, I'm so glad I have this quilt done. I really love the way it came out. And you know, even though I used fleece to line it with, it's actually still really warm and it's really comfortable, and it doesn't feel too thin for a quilt. Even though I've been studying quilt making for like a year because I wanted to make sure my first quilt came out as fabulously as this one did, I still learned a lot during this quilt making process. Obviously, I learned that quilt making is a really long process, but it's also really rewarding. I'm really glad I made this quilt and that I actually stuck to a schedule and finished it in a reasonable amount of time. Of course, I gave myself a few days off, but I think that's necessary when you're making a really involved project like a quilt. If you're just not feeling it, don't push yourself to finish it. Just give yourself a break and come back to it the next day. Obviously, you should use a rotary cutter when you are cutting out quilt fabric. That is something I learned very early on in this quilt making journey. I'm so glad I used this polyester fat quarter bundle rather than trading it out for a cotton fabric that would have been easier to work with. As long as you understand how your fabric works, you can make a quilt out of any material you want. A lot of traditional quilters will use scrap fabric from the clothing they make to make quilts. If you look at this quilt that my grandmother made me, you can see all the different colors of fabric, all the different textures of fabric that went into making it. I'm also really glad I hand quilted this because I think it came out well. But I definitely do want to try machine quilting a quilt in the future, especially since my machine worked really well to do the border with a walking foot. It came out really well. I'm also really happy with the way these corners came out. I just want to show you what happened the first time I tried to bind a blanket. Give yourself a little room when you're going around your corners. I also have to say, even though I'm not a big yellow person, I love the way the quilt back came out on this. I think it's really fun and pretty. And I love the little bumblebees. I'm so glad it came out well because I really wanted to have a good quilt to show you guys in this video. Let me know in the comments how your quilt turned out if you used this log cabin pattern for it. And if you sewed your first quilt because you watched this video, I would love to know how that turned out well, even if it's not perfect. My first quilt's not perfect, so yours doesn't have to be either. I definitely want to make more quilts in the future, especially with that really pretty fabric that I inherited from my aunt. I think it would make a lovely quilt, but making a quilting video is very involved and it takes me a long time. So if you want me to make more quilt videos, make sure you hit that like button, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and leave a comment below so I know that you want more quilt videos from me. Thanks for watching my video. I'll see you next time.